For the last 7 years, I've been investigating the story of the two princes. Working with an army of researchers, we've made the most startling discoveries, which I believe prove what happened to the missing princes.
The mystery of the lost princes in the tower is more than 5 centuries old. Everyone believes their uncle, King Richard III, was responsible for their disappearance. But what many overlooked is that no proof has ever been found. Now, a brand new discovery is about to change everything we thought we knew. We're talking about a series of forgotten manuscripts and royal contracts from across Europe. This evidence, uncovered by the Missing Princes Project, finally proves what Richard III really did, and it's not the story you learned in school. Langley's missing puzzle pieces. For 5 centuries, the story was simple. King Richard III was a monster, a ruthless tyrant who, to secure his crown, ordered the dispatch of his 2 young nephews. The princes in the tower became the stuff of legend, a dark fairy tale used to define a king. But what if that entire story, the one we've all been told, was a lie? What if the man history blames for the crime was, in fact, the only person trying to save them? A new discovery has just blown this 500-year-old cold case wide open, and it comes from a very credible source. Philippa Langley, the historian who shocked the world in 2012 by finding the lost grave of King Richard III under a city parking lot, has turned her attention to history's other great Ricardian mystery. She believed the truth wasn't in England, where the victorious Tudor dynasty could have destroyed any evidence that made them look bad. She believed the answer was hidden in Europe. She launched the Missing Princes Project, a massive team of volunteer researchers who scoured the archives of France, the Netherlands, Austria, and Germany. They were looking for any scrap of paper, any financial ledger, any forgotten letter that could prove the princes didn't perish in 1483. What they found, Langley claims, changes everything. The first clue was a yellowed receipt from Lille in northern France. At first glance, it was boring. Just a financial record for ordering long pikes dated 1487. The thing nobody tells you is who the pikes were for. The document states they were for soldiers serving the son of King Edward, who was expelled from his dominion. Let that sink in. This is 4 years after the princes supposedly vanished. This receipt was ordered by Margaret of Burgundy, the prince's own aunt and King Richard III's sister. Langley argues this is proof that Margaret, who knew the boys personally, was funding a living, breathing Edward V to try and reclaim his throne. But that's not even the most shocking part. The next discovery is, to put it mildly, a WTF moment. In the archives of Gelderland, in the Netherlands, the team found a 15th century manuscript. It's a first-person account, like a lost diary, written from the perspective of the younger prince, Richard, Duke of York. The document tells a wild story. It claims that 2 men loyal to his uncle, King Richard, secretly removed him from the Tower of London. He was smuggled out of England under a new identity and taken on a secret journey through France and Portugal before finally finding refuge. It's a spy thriller, and it claims the boy survived. The evidence just kept piling up. Langley's team then found 2 more documents, this time from the highest levels of European power. One, from an Austrian archive, describes a meeting between the self-proclaimed Richard, Duke of York, and Emperor Maximilian I. The document states that Richard proved his identity by showing the emperor 3 specific physical marks, one near his eye, one on his mouth, and one on his thigh, that he claimed were recognizable features from his childhood. This was a deliberate act of verification. Then the team found the smoking gun in Dresden, Germany, a formal legal contract dated October 4, 1493. In this document, a man claiming to be the prince promises Duke Albert of Saxony 30,000 florins, a massive fortune, in exchange for a full army to invade England. And attached to the contract is a royal seal and a confident signature, Richard of England. Think about it. Kings and emperors don't sign military contracts and offer recognition to just any imposter. They believed he was the real deal. The final piece of the puzzle brings it all back to Richard's alleged hatchet man. A researcher in London found a will from 1516. It belonged to the family of Sir James Tyrrell. Tyrrell is the man who, according to Tudor historians, was hired by Richard to eliminate the princes. He's the #1 suspect. But in this will, decades after the boys vanished, Tyrrell's family is bequeathing a very specific item, a gold chain that, the will states, once belonged to young King Edward V. Why would the murderer's family be casually passing down a personal, precious keepsake from the victim? Langley argues it wasn't a trophy. It was a memento from a boy they had been tasked to protect and smuggle to safety. Together, these 5 documents paint an explosive new picture. They suggest that both princes survived, and that Richard III, far from being their eliminator, was the man who orchestrated their escape. But to understand why these documents are so explosive, you have to know the story they're trying to rewrite. How to steal a crown. The story we all know begins in 1483. England was in a golden age, or so it seemed. King Edward IV was a charismatic and powerful ruler. He was a giant of a man, reportedly over 6 feet 4 inches tall, a victorious warrior who had crushed his enemies in the brutal civil conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. He was in his prime, only 40 years old, and his kingdom was finally stable. He had 2 strong sons to succeed him: 12-year-old Edward, the Prince of Wales, and 9-year-old Richard, the Duke of York. The future of the House of York seemed secure. Then, on April 9, 1483, the unthinkable happened. The mighty King Edward IV suddenly perished, possibly from complications of a cold or a stroke after a fishing trip. His death plunged the kingdom into absolute chaos. The problem? A 12-year-old boy was now King Edward V, and in the cutthroat world of 15th century politics, a child king was a massive liability. The court was a snake pit divided into 2 key factions. On one side, you had the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, and her family. The Woodvilles were seen as new money. They had risen from obscurity to become the most powerful family in the land, grabbing titles, lands, and a ton of influence. The old nobility couldn't stand them. On the other side was the king's most trusted brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was famous. He was a pious, loyal, and brilliant military commander who governed the tough northern border of England. Before he passed, Edward IV had named Richard in his will as Lord Protector of the realm. His job was to govern England and protect the new boy king until he was old enough to rule. Richard, hearing that the Woodvilles were making a fast play for power and trying to cut him out, acted swiftly. He intercepted the new king, Edward V, who was traveling to London. Richard arrested the boy's Woodville guardians, claiming he was saving the king from a conspiracy. He then escorted young Edward to London and placed him in the Tower of London. Now, this wasn't immediately sinister. The Tower of London was, at the time, a royal palace. It was the traditional residence for kings awaiting their coronation. But what many overlooked is that the coronation kept getting delayed. Richard argued that the Woodvilles were still a threat. He then went to the Queen, who was hiding in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her other children. He convinced her, for her son's own protection and to prepare for the coronation, to release the younger brother, 9-year-old Richard. The 9-year-old prince was then taken to join his brother in the Tower. This is the moment the trap was sprung. The 2 Yorkist heirs were now in one place under Richard's complete control. Then came the bombshell. A priest, a man named Robert Stillington, came forward with a shocking public statement. He claimed that King Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid. Why? Because according to the priest, Edward had already been secretly and legally pre-contracted to marry another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler, before he ever met Elizabeth Woodville. In the 15th century, a pre-contract was as legally binding as a full marriage. If this was true, it meant Edward's entire marriage to the Queen was a sham. And that meant all of their children, including the 2 boys in the Tower, were illegitimate. They had absolutely no claim to the throne. Parliament immediately investigated this claim. They found it credible enough to pass an act called Titulus Regius, or the title of the king. This document officially declared the princes illegitimate and stripped them of their titles. With the boys legally removed from the line of succession, Parliament had to find the next rightful heir. That heir, the only man left with clean royal blood, was Richard, Duke of Gloucester. On July 6, 1483, he was crowned King Richard III. The two boys, now just private citizens, were still in the tower. They were reportedly seen playing in the gardens in the summer of that year. And then they vanished. They were never seen again. No official announcement. No record of their passing. They were just gone. The silence was deafening. Rumors started instantly. As long as those boys were breathing, legitimate or not, they were a symbol for any rebellion. The obvious conclusion was that Richard, to secure his new throne, had them quietly removed. This was the story, and in 1674 it seemed to be proven. Workmen renovating a staircase in the tower found a wooden chest. Inside were the skeletons of two small children, roughly the same ages as the princes. King Charles II, convinced it was them, had the bones placed in a grand urn in Westminster Abbey. The case, it seemed, was closed. The story seemed closed. But there was one problem. The entire narrative was written by the winners. Forging a legend. Just 2 years after Richard III took the crown, his reign came to a violent end. He was challenged by a virtual unknown, a Welsh nobleman named Henry Tudor, who had been living in exile in France. Henry's claim to the throne was, to put it mildly, paper thin. It came through a complicated and semi-legitimate line from his mother, but he had an army, and he had a lot of support from nobles who were tired of the chaos. At the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, Richard III was defeated and perished in the fighting. Henry Tudor picked the crown up off the battlefield, declared himself King Henry VII, and started the Tudor dynasty. But Henry had a massive problem. He was a usurper. He had no real claim to the throne other than the right of conquest. And the woman he married, Elizabeth of York, the prince's older sister, arguably had a better claim than he did. To make his rule secure, he didn't just need to be king, he needed to be a savior. And for there to be a savior, there has to be a monster. King Richard III became that monster. Henry VII launched one of the most successful smear campaigns in human history. The thing is, Henry needed Richard to be a tyrant. He needed him to be a child eliminator. Why? Because if Richard was a monster who had stolen the throne from his innocent nephews, then Henry was the hero who had liberated England from a dark and evil king. But if Richard was the lawful king, chosen by Parliament, then Henry VII was just a common thug who had dispatched the rightful monarch. The propaganda campaign went into overdrive. The first thing Henry did as king was to repeal the Titulus Regius. But he didn't just repeal it, he ordered that every single copy of the document be destroyed and that it was illegal to even read it. He literally erased the legal justification for Richard's entire reign from history. He wanted people to forget that the princes had ever been declared illegitimate. He wanted the only story to be that Richard had stolen the crown. The story was then crafted by men working for the Tudors. The most famous account came from Sir Thomas More, who wrote The History of King Richard III. This is the book that gives us all the juicy details. It paints Richard as a scheming, deformed hunchback who was determined to prove a villain. It's also the first source to name Sir James Tyrrell as the man who supposedly carried out the dark deed. But here's the kicker that many people overlook. Thomas More was only 5 years old when the princes vanished. He was writing this decades later. And who was he working for? King Henry VIII, the son of Henry VII. His book wasn't history, it was a political cautionary tale written to please his Tudor boss. And then, about a century later, the greatest writer in the English language put the final nail in the coffin. William Shakespeare, writing his play Richard III, took Thomas More's propaganda and turned it into a blockbuster. He created one of the most compelling and evil villains in all of literature. Shakespeare, of course, was writing for a Tudor monarch, Queen Elizabeth I, who was Henry VII's granddaughter. He wasn't about to write a play that suggested her entire dynasty was founded on a lie. He gave the people the monster they wanted. This is how the legend was built. It was a brilliant political move. It cemented Richard's reputation for 500 years and made the Tudor claim to the throne seem righteous and just. The Tudors built a perfect story. But two people came back from the dead to challenge it. The king's greatest fear. The Tudor propaganda was powerful. but it couldn't erase one huge, inconvenient problem: people claiming to be the lost princes. This wasn't just a random rumor, it was a full-blown political crisis that haunted Henry VII for years. The first challenge came in 1487, just 2 years into Henry's reign. A rebellion rose up, backing a young boy who they claimed was a lost Yorkist heir. This is the event known as the Lambert-Simnel Rebellion. The official story, written by the Tudors, is that this boy was a 10-year-old commoner, a baker's son, who was claiming to be the Earl of Warwick, another Yorkist prince who was locked in the Tower. The rebellion was crushed at the Battle of Stoke Field. Henry VII, in a bizarre move, pardoned the boy and gave him a job in the royal kitchens. But Philippa Langley's new discovery, the Lille receipt, throws this entire story into doubt. That receipt, also from 1487, was for weapons for the son of King Edward, not the Earl of Warwick, and it was funded by the prince's aunt. Langley's explosive theory is that the Simnel Rebellion was a fraud, but not in the way we think. She suggests the boy wasn't Lambert Simnel. She suggests he was the real King Edward V and that he perished at the Battle of Stoke Field. Henry VII, having just dispatched the rightful king, created the Lambert-Simnel story out of thin air to cover it up. It was a way to dismiss the entire thing as a ridiculous farce, rather than the tragic end of the true monarch. As wild as that theory is, the next one is even crazier. In 1491, a second, far more dangerous figure appeared. A charismatic, intelligent, and royal-looking young man landed in Ireland, the heart of Yorkist support. He announced that he was Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes. He claimed he had been smuggled out of the Tower and had been in exile waiting for his moment. This man, known to history as Perkin Warbeck, was not some small-time imposter. He was, to put it mildly, an international sensation. He was so convincing that he almost toppled the Tudor throne. Think about it. The Tudor story is that he was a boatman's son from Flanders. But here's what actually happened. Perkin Warbeck was formally recognized as the rightful King of England by Margaret of Burgundy, his supposed aunt. She welcomed him to her court and taught him the ways of royalty. He was then formally received by the King of France. He traveled to Austria and was officially recognized by Emperor Maximilian I, which is where that document detailing his 3 physical marks comes from. He then went to Germany and signed the Dresden Contract as Richard of England to raise an army. But the most wow factor detail? He went to Scotland, where King James IV not only welcomed him as a brother king, but married him to his own high-born cousin, the beautiful Lady Catherine Gordon. Kings do not marry their royal cousins to bakers' boys or boatmen's sons. They knew who he was, or at least they were completely convinced. This is what makes Langley's Gelderland manuscript so important. That first-person account of the younger prince's escape perfectly matches Warbeck's known movements. Was that manuscript his real story, used as a press release to prove his identity to European courts? Warbeck was a threat for 8 years. He led multiple invasions of England. Henry VII was terrified of him. He spent a fortune in gold and political favors trying to get him. When Warbeck was finally captured in 1497, Henry again did something strange. He didn't dispatch him. He kept him at court under a loose guard. It was a bizarre and risky move. Why? Was it because he knew this was his wife's brother and he couldn't bring himself to end the bloodline? Eventually, Warbeck tried to escape, was thrown into the real Tower, and was persuaded to sign a full confession, detailing his common birth and his entire imposture. Shortly after that confession, he was dispatched. But Ricardians argue that confession was, of course, forced. It was the final piece of Tudor propaganda needed to close the case. So we have 2 completely different stories. Which one is the truth? The truth is still out there. So what's the real story here? For 500 years, one mystery has haunted history, a question so dark it defined a king and a dynasty. What happened to the princes in the Tower? We all know the official story. It's the one Shakespeare perfected. In 1483, King Edward IV dies suddenly. His 12-year-old son becomes King Edward V, and his 9-year-old brother is Richard, Duke of York. But they need a protector. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, steps in. He takes the boys to the Tower of London, supposedly to protect them before the coronation. Then, in a shocking move, he declares the boys illegitimate, seizes the throne for himself, and becomes King Richard III. The princes are never seen again. They vanish from the history books. The assumption? The wicked Uncle Richard had them murdered to secure his crown. For centuries, that was that. Richard was the monster. The Tudors who defeated him were the heroes. But what if it's all a lie? Did Philippa Langley and her Missing Princes project really solve history's greatest cold case? Or did they just find a collection of fascinating but circumstantial evidence? Let's talk down to earth for a second. The thing is, Langley has presented an explosive theory and she has the documents to back it up. This isn't just a hunch, it's a paper trail. We're talking about the Lille receipt, a dusty financial record for a ship that Langley believes was chartered for a top-secret mission to smuggle two very important boys out of England. We're talking about the Gelderland manuscript, a secret chronicle from the continent that names the princes as having survived and grown up in exile. And then, the bombshells. The Dresden Contract, an agreement where the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I officially recognizes a young man calling himself Richard of England, the younger prince, and agrees to fund his invasion to reclaim his throne. This is the man history calls the pretender, Perkin Warbeck. Langley argues he wasn't a pretender at all. He was the real deal. There's the Austrian record and the Capelle will. This will, from a man named Sir William Capelle, mentions a valuable gold chain linked to the prince, not as a trophy of his death, but as a token, perhaps given in thanks for his escape. Together, these documents paint a coherent picture of a survival narrative, a story where Richard III, far from being a monster, was a protector who, seeing the walls closing in, smuggled his nephews to safety on the European continent. In this version, the Tudors are the real villains. When Henry VII took the throne, he found the princes were gone. He couldn't risk them returning, so he launched the biggest propaganda campaign in history to paint Richard as a child killer, ensuring that if the real princes ever showed up, everyone would just call them fakes. It's a wow factor of a theory. It flips history on its head. And for people who have always doubted the Tudor story, this is the proof they've been waiting for. But you see, not all things are what they seem. Many professional historians are pushing back, and hard. They praise Langley's amazing archival research, but say her conclusions are a massive leap of faith. They argue that yes, the documents are real, but they don't prove what she says they prove. Take the Dresden Contract. Skeptics say, of course, Emperor Maximilian would sign a contract with a man calling himself Richard of England. It was a brilliant, no-cost political move. Think about it. It terrified his rival Henry VII and cost him nothing but a piece of paper and a promise. He was destabilizing a rival in a cynical game of thrones. It was 15th century political warfare. And the Gelderland manuscript? They argue it's just what it looks like, a piece of clever propaganda created by Warbeck's supporters to make his story seem more believable. It's a fake news document designed to give their pretender a legend. What about the Capelle will with the prince's chain? The simplest explanation, skeptics say, is often the right one. And the simplest explanation leads back to the traditional story, the one told by Sir James Tyrrell, who supposedly confessed, under torture, to the murders. He said he hired two men known as Black Will and Dighton, who smothered the boys with their pillows. In this version, Tyrrell kept the chain as a dark trophy of the deed or as proof to show his master that the job was done. This is the problem. Every new piece of proof can be read in two completely different ways. It all depends on whether you start by believing Richard is innocent or by believing he is guilty. But what if both of these stories are wrong? What if the truth is something even darker or even stranger? The Richard versus Henry debate isn't the only game in town. Let's look at wild theory number 1, the Tudor cleanup. In this version, Richard III is a bad guy. He locks the boys in the tower, but he can't bring himself to kill his own blood. He just leaves them there prisoners. Then in 1485, Richard is killed at the Battle of Bosworth. Henry Tudor is crowned King Henry VII. He marches to London and finds the two boys still alive, still prisoners in the tower. What does he do? They are the true kings. They are a massive threat to his brand new shaky claim to the throne. The simple solution? He has them quietly assassinated. A Tudor cleanup. This theory is terrifying because it means the very dynasty that gave us Queen Elizabeth I was founded on a secret, brutal murder. Then there's wild theory number 2, the inside job. This one points the finger at someone else entirely. Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham was Richard III's right-hand man, his biggest supporter. But just a few months after Richard became king, Buckingham suddenly launched a massive, failed rebellion against him. Why? The motive has always been murky. But Buckingham also had a distant claim to the throne. What if he was the one who had the princes murdered? He could kill the boys, frame Richard for the crime, and then use the public's horror to launch his own bid for the crown. It was a 4D chess move that just happened to fail. And finally, wild theory number 3, the failed rescue. This one is pure tragedy. In this story, Richard III is the good uncle. He sees the danger his nephews are in from rival factions. He knows he can't protect them in England, so he sets up the escape plan, just as Langley suggests. He puts them on a ship to safety. But the plan goes wrong. The ship sinks in a storm. The boys die of sickness on the journey. They simply disappear. Richard is left in an impossible position. He can't admit they're dead because everyone will assume he killed them. And he can't produce them because they're gone. He's trapped, forced to live with the secret of his failed rescue, all while the world labels him a monster. So, are we missing a key detail? Is there a way to solve this once and for all? The answer, incredibly, is yes. Remember those 2 small skeletons found under the stairs in the Tower of London back in 1674? Workmen were demolishing an old staircase when they hit a wooden chest. Inside were the bones of 2 children, roughly the same age as the princes. Everyone assumed it was them. The bones were declared the long-lost princes, and by order of the king, they were interred in a grand marble urn in Westminster Abbey. And there they rest to this day. We live in an age of science. We have the technology. In 2012, scientists found King Richard III's skeleton in a parking lot. They took a DNA sample, and by tracing it through his living descendants, they proved it was him. It was one of the greatest forensic achievements in modern history. It would be a very simple matter to take a tiny microscopic sample from the bones in that urn and compare the DNA. We could finally know. Are those bones the princes? If the DNA is a match to Richard's line, then yes, they are the princes. They died in the tower. The survival narrative is wrong. So was Richard a monster or a protector? And why won't they test the bones? Let us know below. Don't forget to like and subscribe.